Hi, everyone. Welcome to Who Tells Your Story? I'm Ruta Sepetys, an author of historical fiction published by Philomel, which is a division of Penguin Young Readers Group. And we want to thank the North Texas Teen Book Festival and the city of Irving for hosting this event. And I have to say, when they reached out to me, I immediately said, sign me up. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here with these five. They're not only incredible writers, they're incredible humans with important and unique and meaningful stories to tell. And among other things, their books touch upon identity and representation, and most of all, truth. But they do it in a really unique and moving and memorable way. So I'm going to ask that if you are inspired by these writers like I am, please support them, follow them on social media, use the hashtag NTTBF21. And the festival has set up a bookstore. It's at bookshop.org/shop/NTTBF. So please buy their books, support them. They're amazing books, as you'll see. So the panel is called Who Tells Your Story? So as much as I would like to continue yapping, I want you to hear from these people, and I'm going to ask them to each introduce themselves briefly and just give a bite-sized description of the book that they're going to be speaking about. So Juliet, why don't you start us off?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, hi, I'm Juliet Menendez. I'm the author and illustrator of Latinitas. And it's a book that all began when I was actually working as a teacher in New York City. And like me, I happen to be both Guatemalan and from the United States. I spent my childhood in between the two. I was inspired because my students were from mainly backgrounds from the Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, and as well as Mexico. And I saw in their schools, I was working as an art teacher at the time, that the posters on the walls were people like Benjamin Franklin and Einstein and Picasso. And, you know, the whole idea for the book came from thinking, why are these the only people that we keep seeing? Can we see some fresh new faces? So I started this out as a poster project, and as soon as I delved into the research, I knew that I wanted to really focus on the stories behind these people. And so it started becoming a book. And as I researched, I realized that there was a very big part missing from the research I was doing, and it was women. So the book ended up being about women and celebrating Latinas, because I didn't want to see them relegated to footnotes as I was finding in my research. So that really brought out the feminist in me. And so today we have Latinitas. So.
And fantastic. Ilyasa, I would love to hear from you. Oh, let's see, are you muted? Yep, you're muted.
Okay. So my book is The Awakening of Malcolm X. And I wrote this book for several reasons, but I'll focus on just one. Well, actually, I'll focus on two. One, because my father, you know, the information about my father was so inaccurate that I wanted to make sure that I took control of the narrative. And for example, when my father was in jail, he went at a very young age, running from his identity, Jim Crow, etc. And we discover that Malcolm studied the dictionary, not so he could learn how to read and write, but because he was a star debater. And he wanted to know the etymology of words, so that he could be his best. And he was always prepared, always had a book in his pocket. So that's one thing, one reason. And then the other was to focus on the humanity of inmates. Brian Stevenson, I'm such a fan of his, and he says that we are more than the worst mistake we've ever made, and that a society will be measured on how we treat, and I'm paraphrasing, on how we treat, not by how we treat the rich and the celebrated, but by how we treat the underserved and the incarcerated. And so in The Awakening of Malcolm X, it's, we discover, for example, today, there are 3 million people behind bars, while 32% of our population in America are people of color, 56% are incarcerated. In 2012, the US spent 81 billion taxpayer dollars on correction facilities, not education, not, after school programs, but on correction facilities. And since that the incarcerated population has increased 700%. So I thought that, this was a great way of reading a really wonderful novel, and also learning about the injustice, the criminal justice system, and yes. I hope I answered the question right. I didn't know if we were supposed to tell us about our name or about the book.
You did, but yes, give us your full name.
My name is Ilyasah Shabazz. Ilyasah means God is present. Shabazz means mighty, falcon, and all of those other kinds of words.
Fantastic. Andrew, I'm going to seg to you because I think there's a natural, like a connection almost with some of the topics. So
yeah, well, thank you, Ruta. This is just an amazing panel, everyone. But to be on a panel with Malcolm X's daughter is probably the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. So pretty incredible. My name is Andrew Marinus. I live in Nashville, very close to Ruta. We have the same publisher, also Philomel. She's my role model in this business. I write books, nonfiction, about sports and social justice and history. My first book was Strong Inside. It was a biography of Perry Wallace, who was the first African-American basketball player in the Southeastern Conference. And it's about what it was like to be a teenager in the South during the Civil Rights era as a pioneer in sports. My second book, Games of Deception, was about the first U.S. Olympic men's basketball team at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. So it's about sports, but it's also about fascism and anti-Semitism and the value of the truth. And then my new book, which just came out this week, is Singled Out. It's a biography of Glenn Burke, who was an African-American baseball player in the 1970s for the Dodgers and the A's. And he was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. And he also invented the high five. And unfortunately, he was run out of the game when management of those teams learned who he was. And so it's a story of an injustice again, and a challenge to overcome that.
Eric, please introduce yourself and your book.
Well, I'm Eric Gansworth, South Witness, Eel Clan, enrolled member of the Onondaga Nation. My book is Apple, Skin to the Core. It is a memoir in verse and images, and largely kind of a complicated and ambitious, more ambitious than I wanted to do book, because I come from a very small community. It's about 1,000 people, maybe 5 miles by 7 miles, a reservation in upstate New York, and I grew up kind of living a life of we, and so it's really hard to write a book about I when your identity is we, and the responsibility of kind of wrestling with having to also speak for all these members of my family, some of whom don't want to be spoken for because they're not public people at all, and yet at the same time to know that what I needed or so strongly desired as a young person was in fact stories like ours. And I wrestled with the the structure of it for a very long time. You may not be aware that the term apple is actually a slur in indigenous communities. It's an intra-group slur. It means red on the outside, white on the inside. And I understand other groups have very similar kinds of slurs attached to them. And I thought, as I went through developing this over the years, I thought, wow, there are so many terrible things that other people do to us on a daily basis. Why on earth would we come up with something terrible to do to one another? And so my question then became like the confrontation of saying, okay, I'm an educator. I work in the United States. I speak primarily English. I speak Tuscarora quite badly. And so, yeah, if you're going to hurl that accusation, I guess it's got to come my way, but I want to know why you want to do it. And that was the kind of opening volley of thinking about this book.
That's incredible. Daniel, please introduce yourself. Tell us about your book.
Sure. I had all that time to think about it, and I'm still blanking. My name is Daniel Nayeri. I wrote this book. It's called Everything Sad is Untrue, a True Story, and it's an autobiographical novel that I've been working on for about 13 years, but have been telling since I was 8 years old, because it sort of centers around my mother, my sister, and I as refugees coming from Iran, and sort of having this particular arc of travel that led us from the UAE to a refugee camp in Italy, and then finally to sort of asylum in Oklahoma. And the book begins there. The narrator is sort of standing in front of a room full of classmates trying to explain what life was like before he was sort of the poor refugee kid, but rather was this little prince of Persia, right? Had a father and all these, and a grandfather who had all this land. And as he's telling these stories of the history of his family and the legends and the myths, they all start to sort of mix together in his telling, and really in his sort of flawed memory, because he came when he was very young. And so the stories, as they compound on each other, the classmates begin more and more to sort of second guess and suspect that the stories weren't all as accurate as maybe history would demand, or a historian would demand. And so the young character starts to see himself as a little bit like Scheherazade, who is of course the great storyteller of our culture, of the 1001 Arabian Nights. As we know, Scheherazade is sort of telling a story to a very dubious audience as well, to this murderous king, and she's telling it in order to stay alive, right? Every night she tells the story. Every morning it says, and the sun arose, and the light of the sun hit Scheherazade, and she lapsed into silence. And there we get this pause, and of course, in the oral tradition, you get that feeling of everybody leaning forward, going, wait, what about the rest? And of course, that was the king, and she manages to stay alive for 1001 nights. And here, of course, the parallel in the middle grade young sort of narrator's version is not exactly death. It's sort of social death. It's wedgies and ostracism, but nonetheless, the stakes are high. And so he tells the story, and really what it ends up being is sort of 4 generations of history in my family, until he sort of gets word that his father is maybe going to visit. So this great patriarch, this legendary man from the land of storytelling, from the old country, is going to come visit the very modern Edmond, Oklahoma, and that sort of violent pairing will finally result in our climax. So that's Everything Sad.
Great. Well, I have individual questions for each of you. And honestly, again, I wish we had 5 hours, but we only have 50 minutes. So I'm hoping that you can answer briefly, and then we'll go on to group questions. My first question is for Ilyasah. And because I write historical fiction, I often ask myself, what determines how history is preserved and recalled? And, sometimes with iconic historical figures, what we think we know it might be limited to something we've read, other people's accounts, or quotes that we read. And I believe your father is probably one of the most quoted humans. And so when you approach this book about your father, what details or relevant facts were most important to you to include in the story?
Well, so I discovered over the past summer that my father was quoted 53.7 thousand times per hour in social media. And I would imagine that young people are discovering that what they were taught of Malcolm was inaccurate. And by experiencing this pandemic and questioning our mortality, being forced to watch the horrific death of George Floyd, which, there was a national discourse of people protesting in 50 states in this country and 18 countries abroad. We discover that all of this information that was written by Malcolm was inaccurate. The notion that he was violent, that, he was all of these things that he wasn't, when what he did is he provided the biggest critique of America. And he demanded that America live up to her promise of liberty and justice for all. And he fought and demanded continuously. And so we find that this young man, only in his 20s, when he came onto the scene and then assassinated at 39, look at his body of work, traveling abroad in search of solutions, to this human condition that, of injustice to its own citizens. So for me, I wanted to make sure that I focused on the integrity of Malcolm, because he was guided by his belief in God, his service in God, to God. He believed in the oneness of man, the oneness of God. And that certainly is not what we're taught about Malcolm. And I think this is one of the reasons why that number was so high, because young people were looking for those who spoke truth. And, I just said to my students, Malcolm is still relevant because Malcolm spoke truth, and truth is timeless. And young people looking for strategies that they could employ, tactics that they could employ to meet these challenges of, socioeconomic challenges head on. So again, for me, it was ensuring that Malcolm's integrity was very clear.
It's very clear. The role of the importance of family integrity. The book is beautiful. You've accomplished that so incredibly. Eric, your book, it's a story of life, of family, of community, and kind of the way that those things intersect, if you will. And so how you assembled the book, to me, spoke to those kind of intersections, or that's what it seemed like to me. So I was hoping you could talk a bit about the very special format of the book. It's divided into different sections. There are illustrations, there are photos. And so maybe you can speak to that.
Sure. One of the things that's been, I guess, the life mission of my work is to make sure that we are seen in the 20th and 21st century as living peoples. Indigenous people tend to be constantly cast in the past, often the 19th century, often the plains, wherever Hollywood originated the idea of, the image of Indians, and certainly borrowing from Edward Curtis's photos, which were all about the vanishing Indians and how we were all dying off. And so I think one of our greatest skills and talents has been to take these other things that exist and continue to evolve by using them, but not using them as they are, but to adapt them to our own needs and desires and narratives. And so for me, that choice has been to include a lot of popular culture, in my work, because that's the world I grew up in. The reservation is just outside of Niagara Falls and outside of Buffalo, so like one of the largest or most significant tourist towns in the country. Most people come to Niagara Falls at some point in their lives. Um, and Buffalo is the second largest city in the state of New York. And so we had that luxury, and I think also radio stations from Toronto came in, and so I got like a really great musical education. And my siblings are all considerably older than I am. I'm like a mistake kid. At the end, there's 5 siblings that are maybe 20 years older than me, and then there's my brother, and then like 5 years later, I'm way down here. And so I had exposure to all of their influences too. And so what I discovered in thinking about the word apple and all of the strange ways it exists within my life, I was also interested in not in Steve Jobs' Apple, not in the iPhone Apple, but the Beatles Apple, which was their statement of freedom when they had kind of really grown artistically enough to take control of their own narratives. They created their own record label. They called it Apple. And I really love the intersection of what that meant to be finding your own identity and have it superimposed on the story of them finding their own identity. So I thought I would organize each of the sections based on the various Beatles albums that were produced on Apple Records. The problem is the first one is called The White Album. So I couldn't really go there. And so mine starts off with the Red Album. And because that was true, I then kind of decided to always play a little bit off of what they were doing, and yet at the same time, keep that in mind, because I think what happens within all of our stories is what was happening to them. That as they found their individual freedom, they also found that they were becoming less of a group and finding their own individual voices. So like their freedom then also was their dissolution. And this became like really the story of my recognizing in high school that I wanted to go to college, and that probably meant moving somewhere else. Didn't mean moving far, but we didn't have running water. We had a pump, like a hand pump outside, and we had one electrical box that was hooked up to the meter, and then the rest of our house was wired by extension cords. So whenever you put the toaster on, the rest of the house got like kind of dark, and it was just living too much in havoc. And also, I grew up in this family plot where my cousins next door, they had 10 children. And so we had our 7. So there were always somebody to be distracting and to have a lot of fun with. And I thought, boy, if I'm going to go to college, I'm going to have to find some isolation or I'm going to fail. And so it became the tension of that story of making that choice, to know that if I really wanted to be able to tell a story of a life like mine and of my community, I was going to have to get an education that was going to allow me to do that. And to do that, I was going to have to probably live somewhere else.
Right. Wow. That's incredible. And so Juliet, and in your book, you've created short biographies for dozens of incredible women who represent different nationalities, ethnicities, and time periods. I mean, there's some bit, different time periods and also represent different life destinies. And I know it was important for you to make these women relatable, but my question is, and you absolutely achieved it. How did you do that? Each one of these women is so relatable. Either you feel like you identify with this person and their destiny and their dream, or someone that, how did you do that?
Well, thank you, first of all. Yeah, I think, I was a teacher, as I was mentioning before I began writing this book, and I was really thinking of my students when I started writing and how they end up relating to some of these stories we tell them. And I think we tend to make people into heroes or heroines, and they feel very distant to a lot of children, especially in terms of, when we present them as role models. And they wonder how they got there. And I really wanted them to feel like they could do whatever the women in this book were able to accomplish. And so from the very beginning, I knew how important it was to represent these women as children, so that the children reading the book could see what those first steps were on their path to who they would later become. And when I was doing the research, it was so important to me to find that spark in their childhood, something from their childhood experience that later turned into something related to what they did. And it wasn't always a clear direction, like, oh, she was painting and became a painter. I really tried to look for the little types of things before they maybe even knew what type of profession they would have. And one of the stories that really stood out to me from the beginning, when I was researching this and looking at these different women, I found the architect Susana Torre, and she's from Argentina. And I was looking at her story, and I saw an interview with her where she had talked about how when she was a little girl, she would go into the park that was by her home in Juan, Argentina, and she found this bird making its nest, and she really wanted to be able to make nests too. And she saw what it was doing and putting together the different mud and twigs, and she decided to try and make one on her own. And she did, and she thought that maybe the birds would come in and live in her little nest. And she would wait in the bushes with her cousin, who she brought into this, and see if the birds would pick their nest. And they didn't actually pick their nest. And she thought to herself, like, well, what makes something feel like home? And it's something that really, she had no idea what an architect was. She lived in the countryside in Argentina, and she hadn't been exposed to that. But it was something that stayed with her. And it was just something that really affected me, that idea of what kind of things spark kind of this lifelong idea of what makes something feel like home, what makes something feel welcoming and inclusive. And now as an architect, that's something that's so important to her, making every place feel welcoming to all sorts of people coming from different backgrounds and having different abilities. And so it really fascinated me. And that's kind of what sparked the idea for how to create these stories and start with that little spark.
But each spark feels so genuine and so heartfelt. It does not feel at all as if you said, okay, well, with this one, no, it's so genuine and heartfelt and deeply researched, and that comes across. So thank you for that. And so Daniel, as I was reading your book, I was thinking about the compelling nature of memory and also the nature of our own memory. And the memories in your book, they are so moving, and some are harrowing, and some are humorous, and some are heartfelt. So my question is, how did you organize and select your personal memories and which ones to include in the story? Because there's so many, and there's all, so varied and wonderful.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so that one's a little easy because they're all of them. Those are all the ones. That's it.
There were none that didn't make the cut, or that you thought, oh, Eric was talking about family, and and obviously Ilyasa's book also,
Sure.
Ilyasa's family. So there were none that you didn't think like, well.
There's I think there's a one or two, but really the short answer is about as many as I mean, so the main character, for those who haven't read it, is like when he leaves, he realizes he'll never see his family again, and that's basically everyone other than his mother and sister. And so he sort of begins to become obsessed with what he calls counting the memories, right? So he starts to count. And he starts to differentiate between the types of memories. So with his grandfather, he has this one very, very particular memory. It's his grandfather slaughtering a bull, and every other memory that he can construct around that memory, like the drive to the house or the walk to the courtyard where the bull was, or any of those, he is realizing as he's discovering this, that those were given to him. They were either, you know, a photograph of the courtyard that he saw, or his mom describing those drives, or any, you know, anything we say about, you know, a family member. Sometimes there's just like a story that is attached to that particular uncle. Those are his memories. They're sort of given. They weren't his. And so the ones that were his are the ones that he becomes most obsessed with. And so, yeah, with my grandfather, that's the truth. I have that one memory. And at the end of the book, the main character has a dialogue sequence that's basically word for word what my mother and I had, which is me sort of asking her, like, and knowing all those other stories, as I said, that my mother would tell me, but saying did this one happen? Like, it's pretty weird. It's pretty weird for somebody to slaughter a bull in front of a 4-year-old, 3-year-old. I feel like maybe I made that up. Like, or maybe I read it in a book. We have no idea. He often is trying to run up against this moment where we really are, or should be, far less certain about our memories. And so thankfully, thankfully she sort of confirmed that one. So I was happy that my one is authentic. But with my grandmother, I have 3, and I sort of detail it in the book. With my uncle, I have 1. With my other uncle, I have 2. And so it became actually a bit of an obsession as I was writing it, to sort of parse through all those memories, because I feel like I have more. You know, I have seen a lot of photos, so I do, you know, I construct the birthday party that I'm looking at, and I think, yeah, you know, maybe, but not really. Not if you were to ask me to build them out. Those are the ones. So so, you know, I do have a pretty active imagination, so, as does the narrator. So there's a lot that he makes up. He'll say, you know, of my grandmother, I always imagined, and then he'll tell you this entire story about how she must have had this boyfriend who was a librarian in this one particular village in Iran where the houses are cut, look like they're, and it's Kandavan, is these the houses are set into the sort of the mud slats, and they're gorgeous, and they're weird and askew, and the windows are like completely odd shapes, and so none of that is, I mean, he says in the book, he says, you know, my sister very quickly told me none of that is true. You just made all of it up. And so that desire of saying, wanting to have them more is certainly a big part of the book. But yeah, he sort of specifically comes back over and over again to a line that is a patchwork memory is the shame of all refugees. So there just aren't that many, to be honest.
Well, the feeling that it leaves with the reader is that you want more, and you absolutely feel there's more. And not only with your family, but Tanner, who blows up his tongue on the car battery, or,
Yeah.
I mean, but there's more, and you know there's more there. Yeah. And so that was a great feeling as you're reading, that you wanted more. So, and Andrew, you've won many awards for your writing about civil rights and social justice. So talk to us about the significance, what you feel is the significance of the story of Glenn Burke.
Well, you know, the easy way to talk about Glenn is that he was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. He invented the high five. That's sort of the boilerplate of his story. But what I try to do in all my books is really place the character into the context of the place and the times that they existed, you know. So with Glenn, his story takes place primarily during the 1970s, you know. And so as a young man from the Bay Area of California, starting a professional baseball career, mostly in California, but also in Florida, where the Dodgers have spring training, his life is tracking with the gay rights movement in the 1970s really closely. You know, he's coming along in pro baseball soon after Stonewall. You know, while he's playing spring training in Florida in the early 70s is the same time that Anita Bryant is launching an anti-gay rights campaign in Miami, you know, just down the interstate from where Glenn is starting his pro baseball career in spring training. He's living in San Francisco in the Castro district, the same time that Harvey Milk is ascending as a politician there, and the same time that he's assassinated there. There's a Briggs Amendment in California, which would strip gay teachers of their jobs. And not only gay teachers, but anyone in the schools that supported those teachers could also lose their jobs. At the same time, Glenn is concerned whether he's going to be able to keep his job as a Major League Baseball player if people learn who he really is, you know. And when the truth does come out, the Dodgers offer him $75,000 to get married, and he says, to a woman, you know, and he refuses to go along with that bribery scheme, essentially, loses his career with the Dodgers, traded to the Oakland A's, where the manager says he's not going to let someone like Glenn, quote unquote, his team. And so what I try to do with my books is a phrase that I've heard other people say, is to illustrate the universal through the particular, you know. So it's telling Glenn's particular story to tell larger universal truths. And in this case, you know, it's just one of many examples of people who were considered different for whatever reason, who aren't allowed to really fulfill who they are, you know. And not only does it rob them of their livelihood, it robs all the rest of us, you know. I mean, Glenn was an incredibly creative, funny, smart, innovative person. Here's a guy who invented the high five, something that people in every country in the world know what that is, right? He's the first player to wear Nikes in a baseball game. He was the first pro baseball player ever to play college basketball at the same time that he was playing professional baseball. So he was doing things that no one else had ever done before. And once people found out that he was gay, they said, well, we don't want anything to do with you. And how does that rob all of us? You know, and I think about, we were robbed of such an intellectual and a leader in Ilyas's father also. All these cases of racism, homophobia, sexism, you know, have that effect on that individual person who is involved, but, you know, what a detriment to society at large too. And so that's what I try to do with all my books.
So, no, you're so right. And the next question is for Andrew, you as well, and Juliet and Ilyasa. So there's a lot of educators that come to North Texas Teen Book Festival and that will be watching this. And so if you heard that a teacher was going to use your book with their class, is there anything you would want to share with them or say to the teacher, or do's and don'ts? And you can answer, all of you can answer it. Some of you can answer it. Totally up to you.
Well, one thing I would say is, first of all, I went to high school in Texas, so I'm excited to do this festival. I lived in Austin. I went to Austin High, if there's any Maroons on the call tonight. But I would say, I mean, the chip on my shoulder I have as a sports author is just to give quote unquote sports books a chance. You know, I think they're as legit as any other genre. If there's kids who are in your school who love to play sports or to watch them, you know, they might want to read about them too. And sometimes it's an entryway into becoming a lifelong reader. I think sports books have a ability to be accessible. You know, it's not intimidating to see a basketball player or a baseball player on the cover of a book. And then, but once you open it up, there's so much more to it. It's not about scores of games or statistics. And so that's what I try to get across in my books, is these are, you know, stories about justice. And I think in truth, like you mentioned at the outset, Ruta, and in today's society, I don't think there's anything more important that we need to be talking about with young readers.
I completely agree. And
You know, and I would say that, you know, when it comes to our education curriculum, that we should be very clear that African-American history is American history. And if the terrorism and the subsequent massacres of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in Rosewood, Florida, for example, are taught in high school US history classes to be as American as the Boston Tea Party, then we know that our education would be based on historical facts, and more citizens would understand the necessity for reparation. And we'd have the opportunity to ensure that we're instilling a value system of truth, honesty, and human compassion, as opposed to discrimination, hate, and racism.
But before Juliet answers that, I just have to give a shout out to Sarah Hurley at Jasper High School, who's going to watch this panel. And Ilyasa, she asked, you know, she said, much with the title of the panel, the lived experiences of a storyteller can have a huge impact on how stories are told and how we learn about our own histories. How do you think our school systems should take that into account? especially in the context of Black History Month and when also talking about the history of other marginalized identities. So I know that Sarah's really going to appreciate you touching upon that, that topic. Okay, Juliet, go ahead.
Wow. Yeah, that was one of the things I was going to say as well, is that, what you were just hitting upon, that I think one of the biggest things is really drawing this history into it doesn't have to be in one particular month. And, well, first of all, I'm sure everyone would ideally love to see teachers that come from the similar backgrounds and cultures to begin with. And I think that's a huge thing that needs to be addressed more. But I also do think that if that's not the case, that it's also just very important to just be very inclusive in the way that history is taught, and thinking about it's not this other history that needs to be addressed at a certain point, but just part of the whole story. And that's something that was very important to me while I was writing this book too. And I also think that for this particular book, I would really like to see teachers think about which students do relate to some of to the characters in the book and the Latinitas, and just think about encouraging them, because I know for me, it was so important when a teacher would notice any talent I had, any little thing, it just meant the world to me. And I hope that, when teachers see this book, and if they do think of a student, like Maria Auxiliadora loved to draw with everything, with charcoal from the stove, everything. If they see a student that's like that, to just say, maybe you're a little bit like that. Maybe you would like to be like an artist one day, or whatever it might be. It could be anything. And even if that's not what they decide to be, it doesn't matter. Just seeing them and understanding them, they feel that sense of, wow, she saw me right now, or he saw me, whatever it ends up being, but it just means so much to them. So that's what I would say.
Those seeds, encouragement, those seeds planted of inspiration. Absolutely. Yeah. So Eric and Daniel, so home is a physical construction, right? But even more so, it can be an emotional construction. And home is a huge part of personal story. And Eric, at the beginning, you touched a bit on, possibly having to leave what was your home, and if you were going to go to college. And Daniel, clearly you left home. So now I want to know, how do you view home, like the concept of home now versus how you might have viewed it as a child?
Well, I think one of the things that happens in the curse of living a longer life is that the things you naively once desired unfortunately come true. And my family home, which I had tremendously mixed feelings for, and in fact, when the very first painting I ever made, I'm also a visual artist, was a mural on my bedroom wall, and it was all horror movie scenes. So it's like The Exorcist and Dawn of the Dead and Vampirella and things along those lines. It's a very, very large mural of horror movie scenes. And my mom didn't want me to leave, and she said, if you go, I'm going to paint over that wall. And I said, well, do what you got to do. And that was in 1984. And in 1994, one of my cousins was working on a stock car like racing up on blocks. And it fell off the blocks, and it fell into gear, and it hit our propane tanks, and it essentially blew up our house. And I was leaving work, and I saw smoke in the distance. I worked very near the reservation at the time. And I thought, oh, that looks like it's on the res. I better go see what that is. And I drove, and it was my house. And just as I got there, the wall fell out where my bedroom had been. And so I watched my first painting burn. And so like that adage of be careful what you wish for has certainly been true in my life. And strangely enough, I mean, we didn't rebuild, and my mom went and lived with one of my brothers. And but my cousins still mow our lawn, so we don't have a house there anymore, but we still have a lawn, and it's right next door to their houses, and I go home, and I sit on the lawn. Sorry, it's going to be a little bit vulgar. One of the things I really miss about growing up on the res is being able to pee outside. So I usually urinate while I'm there. I guess it's kind of like a territory marker of some sort. But yeah, so home is unfortunately only existing here now, as it does for all of my family members. But the piece is still there, and we all still kind of are attached to that, the ether of the house that existed.
But when you look at the land, it's sort of like a smile missing a tooth, because there's that where your house used to be, kind of, or
Yeah, it's like, so the lawn is there. My cousin's houses are next door,
yeah.
and then there are trees where my house used to be.
Wow. And Danielle, I mean, you leaving your home, coming to Oklahoma from Iran.
Yeah.
Conscious home.
Well, so I mean, refugee is another way of saying like the global homeless, right? By definition, you don't really you can't go home because you're not welcome. So I in the book there's this the character is sort of exploring that a lot, and certainly I did. I was really obsessed with the idea of my grandfather's home. It was so in the place it's right outside of Isfahan, in sort of an oasis, is a place called Ardestan, which is sort of this area where my grandfather had this home. And homes in this area of the world have as much outdoor area as indoor. Like the house is almost like, it's because there's this courtyard. The courtyard is usually walled. There's trees in the courtyard, and the courtyard, of course, is usually like lined either with stone or brick or inlay, whatever. And there's usually a little fountain, and you can sort of spend much of your time outside as you do inside. And houses are kind of accordingly set, and so he really, the character becomes obsessed with this idea of this house that is hundreds of years old and is in our family, is made of stone. It's not a palace, it's nothing, but it's made out of stone, and that made it permanent in a way that when he gets to Oklahoma and sees that houses are made out of wood and they don't have basements, and and of course particularly poor, so these are not well-made houses. Oklahoma has gorgeous houses made of stone as well, but these are not them. And every time a tornado comes through, the roofs like lift off of these houses, and so he's in this sort of shocking state of looking at this and saying, this is so impermanent, it's so sort of traumatically what is the word, dislocated at all times. There's a scene where he sort of goes up into the roof in the middle of a tornado trying to hammer the shingles down, and he's fundamentally thinking about these homes. And so yeah, there's, at first he sort of is thinking about home in that literal sense, and in the literal sense of permanence, like stone versus wood, grandparent versus no grandparent, and as he sort of explores it and grows into his understanding, there's a line that sort of speaks to it and to me, where he says, well, on a long enough timeline, we are all on our way home. And so he sort of starts to think of his home in a more spiritual sense, in a more eternal sense, a more cosmic idea of where he might see his grandfather again, is certainly without a doubt an expression of hope in a kid like that. But that line sort of ends up being his last I guess like evolution of the idea.
Oh, you guys, I am so sorry, but we are out of time. I want to thank all of you so much. Time, especially these days, screen time, it's so valuable, and the fact that you would share it with the festival and with me, I'm so grateful. I want to thank North Texas Teen Book Festival and the City of Irving for making this possible. And again, you can find these authors online and on social media. Please support them. Hashtag NTTBF21. And please buy their books. Carry these stories, possibly fading stories, into the future in your careful hands. And we want to thank all the educators and schools as well that are bringing their students to these incredible books. And please buy their books. My last plug, bookshop.org/shop/NTTBF. I'm awful at this, but I'm trying really hard. So, so thank you all so much. And thank you again to the festival.
Thank you, Ruta.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.